welcome to episode 108 of Silver Lining for Learning. One of the things you've seen in many episodes is Kurt holding up a book, and I've always been jealous of that. So now I'm going to hold up a book, if I can get the title to show, InnovateHERs. I was one of many, many people who wrote endorsements for this, and we're so excited that the co-editors of the book and one of the people highlighted in the book are all here to talk about the exciting issue of women and purpose-driven entrepreneurship and education. So I'll begin just by asking, you could have written this book probably at any time in the last 30 years, given, your knowledge. Was the pandemic part of what contributed to your saying it might be time to do something like this? Kathy, you want to take that one to start off with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really think so. Bobby and I have been longtime friends, and we talked on a fairly regular basis. And, we were just talking about what's going on in the industry, and we had some time, to talk. And as we talked, we thought, well, there's a lot going on in leadership right now, and women's roles are changing. And of course, Bobby has this incredible background in research and around entrepreneurs. And I have a pretty big cross section of people that I've worked with over the years. So the more we talked, the more it all came together of maybe we could work together and really come up with something. And we both were big storytellers, and we just felt that hearing people's stories would be really important for us, because I think you can learn a lot from stories. So I don't think it was a pandemic, but it's interesting you asked that question, because that's the only time I've really heard that silver linings word. And I love that, because a lot of silver linings came out of the pandemic. And I think as I reread this book, and I do on a fairly regular basis, I think I learned something from each of the people we interviewed every time. So there's just so many silver linings out there.
I kind of had a different, Kathy's absolutely right. We've been friends a long time, and we kept talking about this. But my motivation or impetus for doing it is that I had, being an academic, as well as an investor, as well as a researcher, as well as running companies and investing in them. Had all this research I'd been doing at the last 10 years at the University of Pennsylvania about the mindset of entrepreneurs. And I had began looking at the data and dissecting it, and some very interesting trends started to come up, which is what we talk about in the book. And I decided that I didn't want to write another academic article, and I didn't want to write another academic book that 3 people would read. And so I decided that I would look at the stories and the data. And as I, laughed when we were looking for how we were going to publish it, I said, I really love Malcolm Gladwell's books, because as a researcher, he gives you such stories that you don't even realize how much data you're getting when you're reading it, or Adam Grant. And so the two of them kind of were what I had as a motivation for taking my research and bringing it with Kathy through the stories to being able to look at this topic that would be more of a book that could be used academically, but also could be used in corporations, could be bought for your daughters, or a male leader could buy it for the women on his staff, things like that. So that was our motivation, came from my data and our networking, that we had big networks and great stories we were hearing.
But if I can jump in, I think of both of you as women entrepreneurs, serial entrepreneurs.
Right.
And that's a little different than Malcolm Gladwell or somebody that's writing history. I mean, you've worn these shoes.
Right.
And so it isn't just the stories of the women that you highlight, it's the lens that you bring. Were there different lenses that the two of you brought?
Yeah, I think we did. I mean, we're still friends after the process. We have we still
now that those are good stories. So now if you had more time, we could really tell you some good stories.
We have different we came at this with a different lens, both of us. We came at it with a different motivation for what we wanted out of it personally. And we also, I think, wanted to tell our story, but we didn't want the book to be our story. And we spent a great deal of time with friends and with editors deciding, one, where we would tell our stories and how. We originally, we both had a story in a chapter, and we were going to tell it as one of the same stories as the other 27 women. We decided that didn't really run with the book. We also really struggled because we didn't want this to be a book that got pigeonholed for education, because when you say education, people think of higher ed and K through 12. And this was much broader than that. And so after, again, much research and much conversation, we came up with the purpose-driven, because the people in purpose-driven organizations and that are purpose-driven really fit the model that we were looking for. And they tended to be in organizations that and connected to something related to learning, teaching, and education, such as healthcare areas and wellness and social justice and social impact. And so purpose-driven became sort of the way we looked at, one of the filters we used.
And I think one of the things that we looked at early on is we wanted to make this a book about various ages of people, and we wanted to have different ethnic backgrounds, and we wanted to make this international. And I think that was kind of a real eye-opener as we started talking, because anybody can tell a story, which, I did a book 5 years ago called Real Women, Real Leaders, which was just telling stories about women leaders. But this is more than just telling the stories. It's really looking at all of these really great skills and traits and trying to put them into different categories. And if you look around the people that we did, no matter where you were from, you had some of those traits or some of those skills. So, and again, it followed a lot of Bobby's research, but it was fascinating as we'd interview people, we'd hang up and go, wow, that was great. And we'd talk afterwards how good the interviews were.
So Nisha, you were on the other side of the table, right? You were the interviewee. And what was it like? Was this, do you feel like the whole was more than the sum of the parts for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really all came together when I read the book and saw the other interviews too, and was, just saw these common threads. It's something that I think I'm very confident and used to talking about our organization and our impact, and our big vision and goals there, and less so about myself. And with myself, it's always about myself as a contributor to the organization. And I think for me, that was kind of, even as we had the interview, I think Bobby and Kathy kind of kept pulling me back to me a little bit. And then it was fascinating to read the book. And it's like, this is a thread through every one of the, the different women who are interviewed. So you see that, okay, yeah, it was quite interesting, because I think sometimes it was like, well, I don't know what's so interesting about my story. It's more my organization. Let's talk about that. But it was actually great to read about actually other people who I know or look up to, like Vicky Colbert or Sherry Weston, who I think, again, I kind of only knew the work side of it, and then to understand their story was really powerful and added a really different lens to this. So yeah, that's where I think it was, it was COVID times. We were frantic and busy. So I don't even really remember the interview. And I know there were some other things we did, filling out some of these, the instruments, looking at entrepreneurial mindsets and things like that. That's all a bit of a blur, but it was really exciting to just read it afterwards and see how it all came together. Yeah, and I hope many more people will too.
We also found, and Nisha was a good example of that we kept we had 3 stages to the research. We had looked at sort of the large encompassing data of hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs that had been taking the entrepreneurial mindset profile. And that data kind of gave us a funnel at Penn to look at education entrepreneurs that were coming through our incubator and coming through our master's program. And they took the profile. And when we started looking at the data and we decided we would work with the with these women that we had, Kathy and I had a list of over 100 women that we started with and narrowed it down because we wanted it to be diverse and global and different ages. And we ended up asking them to fill out what we developed at Penn and for our research instrument, a self-assessment of their skills. And we asked them to identify what they perceived as their strengths and the areas they needed improvement in. And that data is given in the back of the book. But it was very interesting as Nisha said, most of the women had never been sort of asked that question and asked to figure it out or think about it. And then on the third part of the research, we actually had an hour-long interview, as Kathy said, and we went over that with them. But we kept drawing them back to their stories, and we asked them to start their story not with their organization, but with their journey to get to the story. So that just gave us such great data and such interesting facts. And as Nisha just said, which was funny, we sent them their stories after we did it. We didn't send them anybody else's stories, but we wanted to make sure we hadn't made any mistakes. And we had quotes in the stories. And there were several of the people in the book that looked at it and said, I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. And it's there, in black and white and in voice, but it was funny for them to actually hear how they had told their stories.
Yeah, that was, yeah.
Sure. I have so many different questions and they'll take us in all kinds of different directions. So one, I think since our show is called Silver Lining, we'll come back, Kathy, to your original comment about the silver lining at some point. But one thing that I've always have been very interested in for the past few years in particular is how leadership, how people develop a sense of values and perspective, sort of this moral ethical compass, and then how that plays out in the design of an organization. And so I did a podcast, it's been a year and a half now, called Value Laden, where I interviewed educational leaders and did exactly what you were talking about, which is like, how did you develop your sort of moral compass? And then how do you make that happen in an organization, right? And in particular, I think organization that you were speaking of in the book, which are what we would call purpose-driven. So I would love to hear from Kathy, you and Bobby about what themes and patterns seem to emerge from these different interviews around this issue. Like this is what I think the world should be like, but now I have to get my organization to believe that, to work towards that, and so on. So I would like to hear that. And Nisha, of course, being in the middle of doing that, how that plays out in your own work, and what are some of the challenges that you think that leaders need to face. And underlying that, of course, is this idea we are talking of women entrepreneurs and what special positives and negatives or strengths and weaknesses emerge out of that. So that's a big question, but in brief, you develop this compass, how do you make your organization see that and work properly that way? So
I'm going to let Kathy start, but we've asked a question that we get asked a lot, and we've kind of narrowed it down to 4 themes that we see of what happens, but we also narrowed it down to the important role that mentors played. And Kathy played a big part in the book in looking at the mentors. I'm going to let Kathy talk about what we found out about mentors and what she said.
Well, thanks, Bobby. I think leadership is a word that a lot of people throw around. What is a leader and how do you become a leader? And, we always get that question, are leaders born or are they made, self-made? Those are all questions that people, talk about. But, we looked at different traits that people had. We looked at the skills that they had. Some of those skills were learned. Some of the traits they were born with, but there is a combination of both of those things together. And I think talking out loud, like when we talk to the women, like Bobby said, they didn't always realize what they said, and they go back and go, did I really say that? And you say, yep, here it is. We had all the words down. But I do think that mentorship was, and I don't want to go into a long thing about mentorship, but mentorship was a major theme in everyone's story. And the idea of mentorship is, we think about as we get into our careers, who are our mentors, but this is starting from when you're a young child. if you read my story, I say, I was the oldest of all the kids. You're just naturally, you get put into that position. So you kind of learn to, take the lead, and you do things that just come very naturally. And then, of course, as you're in jobs, I happen to be in special ed. So I was a camp counselor, well, then you learn those kinds of skills. And then when you go into the workforce, that's a place that you look for people who have skills or traits that you don't have. And you admire people, and it could be a men, women, could be young person. I always tell people, I've learned from people who worked for me, who I would say were my mentors. And we don't always look at that way. So I think that, and I'll let Bobby pick up, between the two of us, we love to talk, we like to sound for our own voice. But I do think that mentorship does play a huge role. And I think I was talking to someone today, and they were saying, no, there's a lot of women's groups now, and I said, not that I'm not all about women's groups, but we're not in just a woman's world. So we have to be learning from men, and we have to be learning from young men and young women and different international people that we've been so fortunate that we've been able to travel around the world and do things. So.
Yeah, and before I talk about some of the other themes, I want to pass this to Nisha. And if you've read her story, she, at the beginning of the story, she talks about the mentor, that why she ended up in Tanzania, and how she ended up starting as a documentary film person. And her mentor was quite interesting and influenced. Do you want to say more about that? It's just a short couple of sentences in your story, but it's a great part of your story. You're on mute.
I'm on mute. Okay. Yeah. So sure. It was interesting because sometimes you just need someone to give you a bit of a push, right? I think I'm someone who, I had that inclination. I'm pretty not risk averse. I have the inclination to kind of go off and do things, but you kind of get told, especially as a woman, that this, here's the path, you should maybe stay on the path. And just having another woman who was a mentor and a professor who was teaching me for a documentary film class say, so I was trying to think about applying to go to film school after my undergrad to make documentary films. And I had just produced a film for my senior thesis. It had gotten into some film festivals, and she kind of said, well, you know how to make a film. Why don't you just use that money to go make a movie instead of spending it on film school? And I was like, okay, good point. If an Oscar nominated filmmaker says this, then maybe I do. And I think sometimes you just need someone else to have that confidence in you to then be able to go off and do the thing. I think especially as women, for anyone, but I think for women even more, it can seem a little bit, I don't know, to say, hey, I don't need the school or whatever, I'm just going to go off and do a thing, as whether it's arrogance or in some cases, I don't know, dilettantish, that it can come across that way. But to have someone else just say, look, you've already done this, you know how to do it, go do it. And then it's kind of like, okay, I guess I have to do that. So sometimes we just need someone else to give us a bit of a push, I think.
And we heard that theme through all the women that we spoke to about their mentors. They were the ones that gave them the push often to go out and do something. We found 3 other themes that was kind of interesting. Like, actually, the first one is the one that Nisha just referenced. We found that all entrepreneurs have high risk profiles. However, women entrepreneurs have a much higher calculated risk profile. They take risks, but they're much more calculated about it. They do a lot of research. They look at the data. They're not slower in doing it. They're just more calculated about the risks they take. And one of the data facts that's most interesting to me is that women return more on the dollar they get in venture capital. They return 67 cents on the dollar, and men return only 31 cents on the dollar. So they have and it's somewhat of a skewed piece of data, but an interesting piece, because not as many women get money. So they're obviously probably the due diligence is more, intense, but it is an interesting trend. And so women are more calculated about their risk. The second thing that we found was that women have high self-confidence. As Nisha said, I don't think it's dilettantish. They just have high self-confidence. And all entrepreneurs need to be somewhat confident about what they're doing. But interestingly, all the women, I'd say almost to every single one in their stories, talked about an experience of having an imposter syndrome, where they didn't think they were good enough to be at the table. Now, I've had this conversation with lots of men, and they say they often have that too, but they're not likely to talk about it. And they're less likely than a woman to say they can't do the job. A woman will often go in and say, well, do you really think I'm ready for this job?
Correct.
And a man will always say, well, I can do that job, even though you know they can't. So that was a really interesting finding. And then the third thing we found out, which I really like a lot, is that women, of course, have a higher interpersonal sensitivity or empathy profile or scale, which you would expect. But the outcomes from that are quite interesting. And Nisha's another good example of this. We found that they had teams that stayed with them longer. Nisha has a lot of the same people she started with 10 years ago that still work with her. She went in and they're more collaborative, the teams that women run. And the one that I really like was that women are able to fire better than men because of their interpersonal sensitivity, because they never go in and say, I'm firing you because you're bad or you're not good. They often say, I don't think there's a right fit for this organization, and let me help you figure out what you should be doing and how to get there. So those were some of the themes that we found in the book that were quite interesting. And they ran across almost everybody we interviewed.
Mm-hmm. I think it's that compassion too, that women bring a lot to the table with the empathy and passion. But the confidence thing is, talk about stories. Confidence is a tricky one because you don't want to be overconfident. And you don't want people to think that you're overconfident, but you have to know you can do something and do the job. And when I first went to work for IBM, it was a time there's not a lot of women at IBM. And believe me, I was not the kind of profile of a woman being at IBM. Chris remembers those days. But I remember even my husband, who was a really wonderful man, he said, Kathy, you're not going to get that job. And I remember looking at him like, well, why? I'm totally qualified for that job, and even my friends said the same thing. It's like, it's going to be really tricky. And of course I got the job, and it was a fabulous role that I had for many years at IBM, but it's a tricky thing. If you just have to believe in yourself and say, I want this is going to fit into what I want to do in my life, and I'm going to get it.
Thank you. I just was reminded of something, Bobby, that from what you said. Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Prize winner who came up with the micro financing thing,
right.
What he found in his data is that the return from women, like he would consistently give these micro loans to women rather than men, because he would always get it back because they would invest, they would do the work and get it back. And the second thing around the imposter syndrome, I was just having this conversation with my daughter. She just got a job and is going to move to Florida. And she kept asking, like, I want to know who were the other people. Did they hire me because nobody else applied for the job? And I said, no other guy. If there is a guy, no guy is thinking that. Yeah. They're all thinking like, yeah, they had the best applicant pool and I nailed it and got there, right? That's so funny. And, and I was trying to explain to her that she's like, no, but, I don't think anybody wanted the job. I'm like, seriously?
Women, and particularly younger women.
I know.
And all the women that were older than our survey, in our book, they had that experience as a younger woman. But I even hear stories of older women. Universities are probably the worst place for it. Women have had struggled in the tenure slots and things like that, and they're often see the men will get tenure with less credentials than the woman who's applying for the tenure slot. So yes, women they're much more sensitive to the imposter syndrome, that they're questioning their skills. The surprise we found in the book, in the data, was that women when we asked women to fill out the self-assessment, none of them picked need to achieve as one of their strengths. And yet on their profiles, that's very high for women, need to achieve. but it wasn't, they didn't see that as one of their strengths. And when we kind of explored that a little bit more with several of the people, they didn't pick it because they didn't want to appear as if they were, overachieving or climbing to the top, or looking as if they were, too ambitious and things like that. Again, it goes back to some of the same imposter syndrome feelings.
Thank you. So I think there's a question from one of our listeners. He's a regular listener, but I think we have sort of covered that, and I want to make sure he's looking at sort of difference between men and women in sort of leadership. I think we've sort of covered that ground. So I want to pass the baton to Kurt, because I know we're already almost at the hour, and Zhao hasn't even got a chance to, ask a question. So Kurt, you're on.
Well, I have two questions, if that's okay. When I met you, Bobby, back in March 27, 2007, you're kicking off the Kuriki project. And 14 months later, when I talked to you again and interviewed you for my World is Open book, it had exploded to like 40,000 teachers from around the world using Kuriki, from South Africa and Indonesia and all around the world. And that was wonderful chatting with you on, the unexpected as well as the expected. I realized that the book you've produced has only been 6 weeks ago, but is there anything unexpected that's happened so far in the process of doing this book, or since publishing this book? Is there anything that's come up other than us being on Silver Lining for Learning, which is of course the number one thing? Is there anything else? And then I have a follow-up question.
Kathy can also answer, Nisha. What I think is most surprising is how hard it is to market a book today. The publishers do not market books for you. And Kathy's in the marketing business. I am not, but I understand social media. And so I don't think we've done poorly in the first 6 weeks of having the book out in terms of the number of books we've sold. But we did realize, unless you're, Michelle Obama or some person that loved Trump and wrote a book about it, the publishers are not, one, paying big advances, or two, helping you market the book. So that's been interesting. And yet, whenever we speak to somebody about the book, they immediately, through one of our connections, will either buy them for their organization or invite us to come speak or to do something around that. So I don't think in the first 6 weeks, I don't know what the average book for this kind of book is, but we haven't done poorly. We've done pretty well, actually, in the first 6 weeks.
Yeah, I think we feel very good about it. But I do think it's that whole grassroots kind of thing where a friend tells a friend, or we've gotten a lot of requests to do book clubs, coming up with discussion questions, things that we hadn't thought about. But I was recently with a group of people, and they were educators. They were like, this would be perfect for our book club. And I want to order copies for everyone in the book club. That's the kind of thing that you really want to get. You want to get that kind of grassroots kind of movement going. The thing I found to be a surprise, and I don't think it should have been a surprise, but how many men are interested in this book for a lot of reasons. They have daughters, we heard that come up earlier, or they have, a wife, or they have a mother. There's a lot of nieces, nephews, they really, but a lot of men are really interested, and they really want to know. Maybe it's just supporting their thing of, I don't know, Kurt, maybe you said it, of knowing that women can do a good job. And then they see these, they read the stories, and they go, well, this is exactly what I've seen that women are doing. So I think that was a big surprise, how many men have been wanting to review it and doing reviews, and it's been great.
And the other thing, Nisha said it, but we found that the women in the book, we go from everywhere that with name people that you'd know of, like Sherry Weston, to other people that we just thought were really interesting entrepreneurs. And they have found that it's a way to make connections. And we've helped the women in the book network because they're in the book together, and the women have helped us network the book.
My follow-up question, and Nisha, if you want to comment before my follow-up, do you have anything you want to add first?
I will say that I have been reached out to by different people who said, oh, oh, I read this book and then you were in it. So it does mean that it's reaching people. And clearly there were people who hadn't heard about it from me. And I think actually just a thought there on what Kathy had said about men being interested in this. We've been doing a CEO transition within our organization, Ubongo, which I led for 9 years. And we've brought in another leader who's another amazing woman, African woman leader, which is what, we wanted to transition to local leadership and find someone who was just much stronger at organization building than me. I'm a startup person. But because of that, I've been having these conversations with different people in our team, who are sharing appreciation. And I have heard from a number of men about how the organizational culture has been so different because we are woman-led, and that how much they appreciate that. And I think that's just something that hadn't, never really occurred to me. I did know that our culture was quite different. We had a lot of women in leadership positions. We do, we talk about purpose, and we use the word utu, which means shared humanity in Kiswahili. We're based in Tanzania. And we talk about all those things, and to hear from men that, gosh, it's so refreshing to just be able to be in a place where it's okay to be nice. And it's not this expectation that I have to be cutthroat. That this could have been Amazon, but I'm so thankful we're not. Those kinds of comments, it's actually really nice to hear. And I think there's, sometimes these things that we think of as feminine traits are looked really down upon when, they're with someone who's a man or masculine, but to hear from men that they really appreciate that and like to be able to work in that kind of way has been really nice.
I should back up a second and just mention what Curriki means in Curriculum Wiki. So it was ground up, built lessons, interactive lessons on the internet. It's much more than that, but for the sake of time here, Bobby can maybe explain it more later. But
well, and I know Bobby's proud that it's still around. I mean, look about, I think how long I've been in the industry. Half of the companies that I've worked for are bought by somebody else, or they're not around. And it's a really a nice thing.
I think what Curriki did is opens the OER world to education. Right. And it was the first group to look at it. I think while it's still around and it's pivoted somewhat to during the pandemic, which it should have, to open source building, having a studio to actually build curriculum using open source content, which was always one of my complaints about, that I couldn't get there at the time because, one, the technology wasn't there, and two, we didn't have the infrastructure to do it. But I do think that there are lots of people that have taken this and made it even better in other organizations. And, I met Sal Khan because he started after Curriki, and in some sense, Sal took it to another place. And if you look at Biju out of India, they took what they did for India to another place. So the whole open source and Mark Shuttleworth's influence on the open source community was exciting. So I felt like I was at the beginning of something, which, like Nisha, I really like to be at the beginning. And it's been taken, it's survived because good people came in after it.
Yeah, the OER event at Rice University in 2007 really led to a lot of things.
Right.
If people want to go back, they can look up the document that came from that, from John Seeley Brown and others. It was fascinating what happened during those couple of days. But I built on the works of Marshall Goldsmith, and he had a book called How Women Rise.
I just bought that book again.
So there you go.
I have it here on my desk too.
So I'm buying this for everybody, and I'll recommend it. But 20 years ago, I read his earlier, 22 years ago, I read his Learning Journeys book. Mm-hmm. And that book was about corporate HRD, HPT people, their best teachers. And I said, I always want to do a book like that. Yeah. And so finally this year, I have a book that came out called Transformative Teaching Around the World, which is 2 stories of former Fulbright teachers here at Indiana University and how they're using the content to transform education in their countries. Mm-hmm. But I've done different books and the collaborations vary. And so my question for you relates to, what can you tell new people in this field that are thinking about writing a story type of book or engaging in a collaboration to produce a book? What types of publishing guidelines, tips, ideas could you provide for people? What made your collaboration successful? and what kind of things should people avoid? What kind of challenges or barriers should they be on the lookout for? So more of a writing advice kind of question.
I think Kathy and I both wanted the same thing in the end. I think, and I knew, and Kathy knew what how I worked, and I knew how Kathy worked. So we bought into that, and wasn't always perfect, our working styles, but it worked. But I think the most interesting thing we learned in the collaboration is about halfway into it, and during the pandemic, I was struggling with the writing of getting this book to be able to run. We had all the stories written. I had all the data chapters written up. I was having a really difficult time running them together in a way that, brought the themes out. And I had a student of mine had been looking at the data for me, Laura, who's mentioned in the book. And I said to Laura, I really need somebody to take a first pass at the draft of blending the data in with the stories. I had kind of outlined it all. And without Laura, I don't know if we would have had this book written, because we had to step back from it because we were so engaged in it to look at just what the data said and how the stories related. And Laura and I spent hours each week talking about it so that she knew what I wanted and how to write it. But I needed a single writer bringing that together, and Kathy and I agreed. And we made that choice, and it was a cost to us to do it, but it was worth the cost we paid. And Laura was phenomenal. I think the other thing I learned is that the people in the book were so cooperative. We had clearly we had busy women, and getting them to read their stories or to respond to us was not always the easiest, but when we would kind of say, we really need this, we always got answers. We didn't have anybody that didn't approve their stories, didn't approve their bios, didn't look. So we were lucky to have great women that were part of the project.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I've worked for a publishing companies my whole career, is making a book not too big, looking at the type size so it's not overwhelming, having a few graphics to kind of add to it, dividing it up a little bit so that it's not so dense. Somebody gave me a book the other day. I thought, you got to be kidding me. You think I'm going to read this? It was like 800 pages. The print was so small. I'm like, it's not going to happen. But I do think keeping it simple, and I mean simple in a way that we had very smart women that we interviewed, and they shared a lot of wisdom with us and a lot of real life stories. And we really wanted it to flow. And I think Bobby and Laura, like she said, spending all that time going over this back and forth. Is this reading right? Do people feel like they're learning something when they finish a chapter? They don't have to wait to the end of the book. And I think we were able to, pick up some of those things. I mean, it is great. I loved listening to Nisha again. As you talk to these people who are in the book, they're just so passionate about what they do, and then the exuberance, and it all comes out. And I think that's what we tried to get that in the book. We wanted to capture some of that.
And we spent a long time trying to figure out who we wanted to write for the foreword in the book. And we were really lucky to, be able to get somebody to do it. But we went from, getting everybody from Hillary Clinton or Chelsea Clinton. And then we wanted to have people that could make it, that also were running purpose-driven organizations to write about it. And I think the forward does bring that together. And Carol Stern is amazing. And she's now running the Walton Family Foundation and the executive director. And before that, she was running US UNICEF. So she's got a background that brought a lot to the story. And she told her story. She didn't just write a forward, but in the forward, she tells her personal story and her parents. And I think that sort of brought the book together. So all the little things that we did, and I've written, over 15 books too. And but they've all been academic books on computer literacy or programming or ed tech or kids books, this was a really different experience for me. Will I do it again? I don't know. But did I enjoy it? Absolutely.
So this is quite fascinating. you're running with a panel of men only. So our show, we need women. We only have like 4 men sitting here. So this is
We have 27 of them you can ask to be
okay,
one of
this is
your-
very
You're handling it
educational.
well. You're handling it well.
Oh, well, thank you. And well, we might have the imposter kind of syndrome as well. So when Punya was talking about that, I was thinking about my daughter, who is now in Philadelphia in a coffee shop with a philosophy degree. So she is trying to do something. But anyways, I should send her a copy of the book. But anyways, so one of the things we do on Silver Lining is always think about our audience. Most of our audience are teachers, educators, are thinking. So, and also in education, we have really 2 interesting problems. About 10 years ago, I wrote a book about entrepreneurship and creativity, which really was trying to drive to the idea to say, are entrepreneurs born or they are made? So this is the question, because you have such great data. In a sense, to say, what can schools do? Because my view is this, no matter it's born or it's made, you can make someone more entrepreneurial. So no matter what happens, right? So I would, all out of this 28 women, in your situation, I'm going back to, the Harvard biologist, Richard Lewontin's book called by, Genes, Organism, and Environment.
Right.
Environment. And so what can schools do? So assuming, people are born with certain higher level of, let's say, opportunity awareness. Some people are lower, So yes, that, maybe at the Penn or wherever you do. So what could schools or what could environments do? Mentors are important, but not everybody is lucky to have a mentor, and not everybody is lucky enough to have the right mentor. So I was just wondering what kind of lessons, suggestions you might give to our teachers, our schools. All of 3 of you, feel free to jump in, please.
We do ask, our questions we asked our interviewees are at the end of the book also. And one of the questions we asked was, do you think entrepreneurs are made or born? And it was very interesting. Overwhelmingly, I would say they initially said that they were born, but they said that they were actually improved as an entrepreneur. They wouldn't have necessarily become an entrepreneur if they hadn't been born with a certain set of traits, but they were able to be a better entrepreneur through the skills that they learned and through their mentors. So I think we believe mentorship is essential, as Kathy says in her chapter in the book. But I think there's other ways to engage in looking at your entrepreneurial mindset to improve. So how do you learn to be collaborative? How do you learn to work with teams? How do you learn to understand how to do future focus? I just read an article in the Harvard Business Review about the fact that most leaders don't have the skills to look at the future. Chris, that's your area, so I'm not going to step into the future area. But and I think those are some of the things that's one of the entrepreneurial mindset skills, future focus. And so I think there's areas to look at that we can give you skill sets. And when I run the master's program at Penn and we look at what we do with our entrepreneurs, we've come a long way in making it be more journey stories, and rather than working towards a pitch to raise money. And we've evolved in what we think is important for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I would say, I have a family of teachers and friends that are teachers, students. I think knowing these skills and traits is really important in starting to embrace kids that are independent, starting to embrace these kids that have, that are problem solvers, and because these are really, really important skills. And a lot of times we squash innovation. Now here I'm talking to Chris, who's Mr. Innovation, and Yang Zhao, but we squash innovation. That's not a great idea, or I wouldn't do that, and I think so I think teachers, I would encourage teachers to read this. In fact, our audience, we're giving this out to a lot of superintendents, and we're getting really good feedback they want to share it with the teachers in their schools, and companies want to share it with the people within their companies too. So the people are really celebrating these traits and skills.
I think I have this sort of vision of what I think universities are probably the worst place for innovation in the world. They tend not to be innovative in themselves. So I have this sort of dream that I'm going to change the way we accept people in the graduate schools of education. And instead of having them fill out a traditional application, we're going to say, tell us what problem you want to solve. And we're going to let you spend 2 years looking at solving that problem. And here you're getting into this wonderful lab that has these great experts, the professors. You can take the courses that you think will encourage you to solve your problem, and you can bring in outsiders to be part of your team. And when you graduate, you haven't written a thesis, although it could be called a thesis. You now have a solution to the problem, whether it's a company or whether it's a product or whether it's a process. And I just think we're looking at the way we think about how to encourage innovation. Right from the beginning, we're looking at it wrong.
Yo, Bobby, I think that the worst place may not be universities, at least not your universities, but your university. Think about schools,
Right.
the whole spectrum of K-12 schools, kindergartens. So think about that. That'd be Nisha. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I was gonna argue with you only on kindergarten. I think good kindergartens encourage innovation. I think is it Mitch Resnick who says everything I needed to learn, I learned in kindergarten.
Right.
And then as you add those layers of right answers and sitting quiet and listening, you're actually, getting rid of the innovations. So
He went to a good kindergarten, and I did not go to kindergarten. But
play
anyway, go ahead,
based
Nisha.
kindergarten, project based, yeah.
You spend a lot of time thinking about this, Nisha, and have done.
Yeah, I mean, we work in early childhood, but I would actually reinforce what Bobby said, and I experienced it myself with going through. So I don't have an MBA. I didn't study business, and yet I, was a founder, and it's just something that I honestly wouldn't have understood that much or put much into if I just studied it academically. But then participating in this program, the Education Design Studio, which is where I met and worked with Bobby, we could take actual problems we were facing in our organization, right? And I learned how to financial model and to create a model of, what we were going to do, because I needed to do that to solve a problem I was really passionate about. It was completely different from sitting in a classroom and just trying to learn that abstractly. So I would really push for more, project-based learning and allowing students to pick what it is that they want to use to, apply these different methods. I think I was a good student. I was someone, I wanted to get good grades. So I studied hard and did that. But when I think about the skills that I bring into my work, it's not because I was a good student. It was the fact that I got good grades, allowed me the freedom to go and do other things. It opened up opportunities, or it made my parents not so worried. And I got to do all these exciting things outside of school, as long as I kept my grades up. And that's actually where I built the skills to be entrepreneurial. So I think there's this weird thing that happens where the more we try and, force kids down a certain way of learning, the kids who maybe aren't as good at that test taking, which who knows if that matters anyway, have to spend so much time on it that they just aren't getting the opportunities to do the other things that would help them thrive. So I'm all for the projects and the passion and how to bring that in. I know it's hard as an educator, but it makes a world.
Nisha, you are revolutionary, and but there are, actually our whole show, over 100 episodes, have been dealing a lot with this kind of innovations. We got to bring you back to talk about your work, besides being, a person in the book. Chris, go ahead.
So in the remaining time, I wanted to have a hypothesis tested. So I have a hypothesis about the return on investment data. Why would women be doing better than men? And I think it explains at least part, but I'm curious as to what you would say. So I've been thinking a lot about dispositions the last couple of years. And a disposition, briefly, is whether or not someone chooses to use a knowledge or a skill that they have in a particular kind of situation, or whether they don't. And in the pandemic has really, for me, highlighted the importance of dispositions, because we see all around us people with roughly equivalent knowledge and skills, and some of them are paralyzed and some of them are empowered by the fact that the pandemic is disruptive, turbulent, and uncertain in terms of the opportunities it's created. It's the silver lining concept. And I've co-authored a brief on dispositions that lays all this out much more academically, and an op-ed co-authored that does it, more informally. Actually, yesterday my co-author and I got an award for in the iLearn International Conference for the workforce-related paper that made the largest contribution, and it was about dispositions. So my hypothesis is that if a group has been marginalized by society, women, low SES, different kinds of ethnicities, neurodiversity, sexual orientation, that group is likely to have a stronger set of dispositions for creating success than people who've come out of privilege, who've just kind of had no barriers to success, and so it's been sort of handed to them.
We addressed
It's the
that.
opposite. It's the opposite of the deficit model, because the deficit model says you're broken, marginalized person, and we're going to come in and help fix you, which of course is a terrible place to start. Through the lens of dispositions, you say you actually have some superpowers that privileged people don't, that you may not realize, which is why you have an imposter syndrome, that you could be taking advantage of. So I'm wondering if this resonates with you at all, or if it's just, well, not really.
Two things you said absolutely resonate. Chapter 7 in our book talks about inhibitors and activators. And we actually talk about exactly the things you did, where they came from. Many of the women in the book came from single families, or they ended up, one of them lived in a commune, because with a single mother who died when she was like 14 years old, Silver McDonald. We also have a woman that basically grew up in a trailer park, but it was because of her mother that she saw all the things that the mother had to do to make survival in the family, that she became an entrepreneur, and she almost didn't learn how to read if it hadn't been for a teacher, and that's Jamie. So we have all sorts of books. The other thing we found was that the women are, because they take calculated risks, were less likely. They didn't have safety. If they didn't have a safety net, meaning, as Nisha described, her parents let her do that, and she had some privilege to be able, she knew she wasn't going to starve. She always had a place to go home to. But and so that became a big theme in the book. So the disposition played a big part. And the other thing, one of the themes that runs through the book around disposition is that almost everybody in our book had this idea of wanting to do well as do good. And because they wanted to have an impact. And several times, we almost named the book that, because it became such a big theme through it. And one of our authors, Lisa Hall, she actually said it in her interview about how her disposition is that she grew up wanting to do well and do good. And she said it was luck that gave it to her, because she ended up in her first job after she graduated from her Harvard MBA, went to Wharton and got a Harvard MBA. She ended up working in a bank where she was assigned to the area that gave loans to low-cost housing. So then she said, boy, it was like a miracle. I could now do well and do good. So her disposition actually drove her career. She ended up being the head of the Calvert Fund, which was community funding.
But I think in companies, you're seeing that more and more too, with so much of the social impact stuff going on, that people really want to work for a company that's doing that kind of thing. I mean, certainly at Harvard, with the ALI program. We really, I mean, we have several people in the book who are part of the ALI program who were very successful lawyers who took on, things like, Mary Louise Cohen, going and getting these visas, these people to get jobs out of, Afghanistan. But one of the things that you were talking, Bobby, one of the things I think that was an eye opener for us was how many women, when we asked the women who was the most important person in their family that made them to be the entrepreneurs they were, they said their mothers. Now, I had done another leadership book where if you ask that question, they'd say, my father, he wanted me to be a leader. I was a leader. This clearly was, I watched my mother raise a family. I watched her go to work. I watched her, join the PTA. I watched her get involved in the community, that she could juggle everything. And that's what really taught me that I could be an entrepreneur. And I think that was really a surprise for us.
It was. And we also stayed away purposely. We stayed away from making this a leadership book.
Yeah.
Because we believed that the skills and traits of entrepreneurial mindset would create leaders, but we didn't want people to read this book and think, oh, this is how you have to do to become a leader.
Mm-hmm.
Nisha, do you have thoughts on this?
I mean, I would agree with everything that's said. My mother is a force of nature and an innovator in her own right. And I think I kind of grew up thinking like, well, aren't all people like that? And, you're trained to do things and expected to do them from a young age. Though on the data part, I think sometimes when I see data like that, where it's like, oh, women, if women's companies are so outperforming men's, it's probably also just a sign of bias that you have to be so much better as a woman to get that investment. I think that also, but then it means you don't have a sense of entitlement. So when you come into something, it's just a little bit, you kind of feel this maybe a greater sense of responsibility. And I've seen that when we're in fellowship programs. I remember showing up at this program that I was selected for, and we could get grant funding out of it. And they'd given us 2 books to read beforehand. And I arrived and I was kind of, talking to 2 somewhat privileged white guys who are also in it. And they're like, oh, did you read the books? I was kind of like, you didn't? Like, who would not read these books? Of course I read the books. And all the women and minorities in the group who I talked to were like, yeah, of course I read the book. They told us to read a book. I did it. And so I think sometimes if you don't have that sense of entitlement, then you just, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing of like, you follow the rules and do what people are expecting. But I think it just bred that sense of responsibility. And of course, I'm lucky to be here. I think that I saw it reflected in a lot of other women's stories too, where you just feel that like you've really lucked out to be doing this. So you better put everything into it and make sure you do everything you can so it'll go well.
So may I just add one thing? I would really invite you guys to do another book on males, from a women's perspective. Just analyze them. I think you might get some really interesting stories, So I invite you. I will be expecting to talk to you on episode 109. That's about that
How could we write that fast?
That's
Well,
right.
I think it helps to have good male friends.
No, because it'll be a very short book.
Exactly.
So we're almost out of
learn.
time.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, but Punya mentioned his daughter. I have a daughter who just graduated from Smith College, women's school in engineering. She's looking for her first job. I'd like to ask each of you in about 30 seconds, because that's really about how much time we have. Each of you in 30 seconds, what should significant others in young women's lives be saying to them that's going to help them with this kind of first step in the career period?
I would say 2 things to them. One, use your network. Most young people do not understand how they use the network. And so use your network and use it in thoughtful ways. And the second thing is to value your skills, that you are good enough to do whatever you want to do. As much as we say that to our children or to young people graduating from college, they often don't believe it.
Well, and I would add to that, I would say, look for people who really believe in you and appreciate the kinds of things that, you bring to the table. And I think that a good mentor, you trust them. And I think that's very, very important, that people are encouraging you to go out and do things that maybe you wouldn't do.
I might say there's no right or wrong choice. Just do what you do and then make it right for you. I think a lot of us sometimes it's like, oh, what is the right thing? What should I do? To then back them up on what they choose and believe in them.
Let them fail and know that that's not wrong. It's not bad if you fail. You can always do something else. I mean,
I know we're running out of time, but when Yang Zhao said something about schools and teachers and walking to a school, I just remember my niece, the first day of her teaching, and she's a really good teacher today. She walked into the teacher's room and she had an idea, and they all looked at her and said, "We've done that 1,000 times, can't be done." And she never wanted to bring up another idea. Now that's different, 20 years into teaching. But I think that's what happens sometimes, is encourage people to really talk about their ideas.
yeah.
Well, I just really want to thank all of you for coming. It's been great that you've shared with us. We know how busy you are, and it's terrific that you made the time for this. Kurt, do you want to talk about next week?
I certainly do. And I'll also mention that I bought 4 copies of your book during this
Oh, we
time.
love that.
Thank you. Buy more.
3 for my former students and current student, and 1 for myself. And I was going to title my transformative teaching around the world book "Making Impact," just like you were going to. But my publisher, Routledge, I shouldn't say this on air, but they changed the title. So we made the preface before Making Impact, the chapter 1, Time to Make Impact, and the last chapter, after Making Impact. But anyways, next week is the 4th of 4 sessions I've been hosting on related to global education. So the 4th person, his name is Lawrence Peters, and he has a new book, Creating the Global Classroom, Approaches to Developing the Next Generation of World-Savvy Students. Will be in episode 109 at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And Lawrence believes that we need to integrate global education to everything that we do. It needs to be part of everything that we do, and I can't agree with him anymore. And it'll be a fascinating session, so I invite everyone to be next week. And I want to thank everyone who's been here this week. Thank you very much.